And so without further ado, so that we can stay in time and keep being as smooth as we have been, I would like to introduce our next speaker, who has very kindly woken up extremely early to talk to us today about realistic and symbolic threats of COVID-19 and their unique impacts on well-being and adherence to public health behaviors. So how threats to safety and identity predict well-being and how this relates to health behavior. Frank, thank you so much for joining us today, and I leave it to you to share your screen and share your thoughts.
Great, and thank you again so much, for organizing this conference. Okay, so everyone can see this, my screen? Okay, great. So my name is Frank Kachanoff. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of North Carolina. And today I'm going to be presenting work which me and my colleagues have been doing to understand both the realistic and symbolic threats of COVID-19 and their impacts for our mental health, as well as our adherence to public health behaviors. So it's without question that COVID-19 is a threat that is impacting all nations across the globe. Just on July 19th, there were over 14 million confirmed cases and 600,000 deaths from COVID-19 worldwide. So this is a threat that we need to handle collectively as a community, and psychology has an important contribution to make in this endeavor. We can help understand how this threat will impact our mental health, both now and after the pandemic, and also what predicts whether or not we'll engage in the public health behaviors necessary to mitigate this threat. But for us to do this as effectively as we can and want to, it's important to take a step back and ask, what is threat? What are the threats that COVID-19 pose to us psychologically, and how can we measure this psychologically? So when we think of threat, we might most often think about threats that impact our physical safety and the scarce resources we depend on to survive. So I might see a very large venomous snake as threatening. I might worry about not having enough food. And these types of threat in the psychological literature are referred to as realistic threats. They're very tangible threats to our physical health and our scarce material resources. And in the context of COVID-19, it's very clear how this virus presents a realistic threat to us. We might have concerns about getting infected with the virus, becoming very ill, or even dying. And as well, the pandemic has caused global shutdowns of work, which has led to massive layoffs and a very negative impact on the economy. And so there's been extensive and very important research already emerging in the literature on COVID-19, which looks to understand the implications of these realistic threats, and also realistic threats in terms of people's past work on understanding infectious diseases and their psychological cost has often focused on these realistic threats. But people are also very social animals. We form groups, and in those groups, we form meaningful cultures and identities, collections of values and normative ways of living and lifestyle that give us meaning in our lives. And yet when these become threatened, these more abstract threats to our identity, our values, our meaning-making systems, such as religion or institutions, these are referred to in the psychological literature as symbolic threats. And there's extensive work which shows that symbolic threats also have an important psychological impact on us. So for example, a lot of who we are as individuals, we derive from our social groups. I might look to my social groups to know what goals and behaviors I should pursue. I derive my sense of esteem and personal autonomy from my social groups. Even my very sense of existence are bound to these social identities. So for example, as a Canadian, I might feel most comfortable with a hockey stick because I see other people in my group, other Canadians tend to play hockey. And so I gain a certain sense of psychological well-being and coherence and comfort from being able to act in a way that the members of my group do. But the dramatic social changes which COVID-19 have impacted on our communities have drastically changed the normative lifestyle in our communities, our ability to express the way of life we once knew and understood, our ability to express the values potentially that we associated with our social identities and our communities. And so in understanding the pandemic and the threat it poses to us, we really want to understand both of these threats. And we, again, can see both of these threats popping up in the headlines that have made news over the course of a virus. So headlines about the magnitude of death and health risks, the economic impacts, these realistic threats, but also questions like, will we be able to keep using the handshake? How will our students go to school? These basic systems, such as the education system that we rely on. And even more, these are headlines from American newspapers, but this sense of a normal life being on hold, a sense of Americans losing this value of freedom and independence that they really value. And so we're gonna, in my work, I really try, and we've really tried to understand both of these threats hand in hand. And we were inspired by a theory in social psychology called integrated threat theory, which really emphasizes using these threats and understanding these threats simultaneously. And while a lot of this work has stemmed from the intergroup conflict research literature, we're really applying it here to make sense of what is going on. And in doing that, we can see something we can think of as almost a social distancing dilemma. Well, if I stay inside all the time, I might mitigate the realistic threat. I'm not around those who can spread the virus. I can't contribute to that spread, but yet this is really going to change my sense of being able to just go out and about whenever I want to, and it exacerbates this sense of symbolic threat. Where conversely, if we trudge along and say, let's just go on as if nothing's really impacting us, we might try to mitigate this symbolic threat, but this will exacerbate realistic threat. We will spread the virus. And so a set of unique predictions can be made and formed for each type of threat we'll experience. In terms of realistic threat, we'll expect the more we experience this threat to impact greater mental health, greater distress. We're concerned about getting sick, dying, but we might engage in greater social distancing behaviors to mitigate this threat, because if I stay home, I can stop the spread of the virus. On the other hand, in terms of symbolic threat, we'll also potentially expect it to have this important impact on our mental health, but here we might see it leading to actual less engagement in public health guidelines to social distance and stay at home. So a quick roadmap here. I'm going to show you some data we have, which is in which we have been trying to validate a scale to measure both of these types of threat, and also data in terms of what they predict, showing that they're meaningful in terms of our impact on our mental health and our public health behaviors. So we developed a 10-item scale to assess these two types of threat. We tried to make it as short and simple and easy to administer. So a quick 10 items. The first 5 items all get at realistic threats. So do you see COVID-19 as a threat to your personal health and the personal health of your nation as a whole, and your personal financial safety and the financial safety of your nation as a whole? And we actually adapted these items from the Pew Research Group in the United States. But then we also developed 5 new items to assess symbolic threats. So is it affecting what it means to be a member of your nation, the values and traditions of your nations, the basic rights and freedoms of people in your nation, your democracy and the maintenance of law and order. So these more kind of abstract symbolic concepts. And so I'm going to present to you work of 4 studies. So a first study, we collected data, and all of this is from American participants in the United States, recruited through MTurk. In the first study, we assessed this threat, our criterion outcomes, and also different personality traits that we expected to be more or less related to threat sensitivity to get convergent and divergent validity. We then collected another sample about a week later, again in the United States, same measures. We then followed up on the participants who were in study 1. Some of them came back and did the study again, where they again completed the COVID-19 threat scale so we could assess its invariance, its metric invariance, and also how longitudinally these threats can predict criterion outcomes. And then finally, in data we have not yet published, we followed up participants who had partaken in one of these initial studies again and assessed in the United States, there's a big holiday called Memorial Day, which I'll explain in a bit more detail later, but it's really tied to American identity. And we wanted to see how these threats impacted social distancing on these behaviors, measured 2 months earlier, how this predicted longitudinal behavior later. So just to give a quick sense of, do people actually experience these threats? I'm going to report the means from when we assessed in these first initial 2 big waves. And we see high levels of realistic threat, not surprisingly, around 3.2 on a 4-point scale. And we see lower means in terms of symbolic threat, but also not trivial, above the scale mean. And we also see that they're positively correlated, not extremely highly, so they're distinct concepts, but we see that correlation. So it's, you know, when I present this work, sometimes people think of like, who are these people and those people? We kind of lump them into buckets, but really we experience both of these threats. And it's not an us, them necessarily. These are things that go on simultaneously in us and are pushing and pulling our behaviors in different ways potentially. So just some quick information about the scale validity. In our first study, we did exploratory factor analysis and found that the 2 sets of items loaded onto 2 distinct factors as we predicted, and we confirmed this factor structure in our second study. And then finally, when we did our first longitudinal follow-up, we found temporal scale invariance. So the metric is still the same metric later on. So if you think of metric invariance like a ruler, the ruler didn't change a week later, which is important for us to consider when we develop a scale. In terms of convergent and divergent validity, there's a wealth of different personality traits in the literature that have been associated with threat sensitivity. And we find we would expect these to relate positively to both threats. And overall, across 2 studies, we do find that both threats related to a belief in a dangerous world, this need for cognitive closure, and our emotional stability. We also found that symbolic threat, but interestingly not realistic threat, was related to conservation value. So this need for security, tradition, and conformity. And that makes sense in that when you think of what symbolic threat is, it's really getting at the traditions and the norms and customs of one's group. And then also another important thing to consider is divergent validity. So is our metric relating to everything, or is it relating less strongly to things we wouldn't expect as clear an association with? And we find that it's less robustly and reliably associated with other personality traits or values that the literature wouldn't suggest to be as closely linked to threat sensitivity. So now, in terms of our main outcomes of interest, I'm going to present this in sets. So first our mental health outcomes, and then our public health behaviors. So I'm going to focus on today 3 outcomes of mental health we assessed across our studies, which is general anxiety. And then the impact of the event. So this is a metric of psychological distress from a traumatic event, and you can chunk it into two parts. Just, is it intrusive to us? It's really, you know, intruding on what we're thinking about, even when we don't want to think about it, versus eliciting an avoidance response, actively trying to distance ourselves from this distressful event. And again, here, we're going to predict that both threats are going to predict greater distress, greater anxiety. So here I'm going to show you results from a SEM analyses where I had the two threats predicting these outcomes simultaneously, all in one model. Things in blue represent a significant positive relationship. Things that will be in red will be a significant negative relationship. And white will be a non-significant relation. So in our first study, in terms of realistic threat, we found that it was positively associated with both anxiety and impact intrusion, but not impact avoidance, so this kind of pushing away. And in terms of symbolic threat, we found positive associations for both types of impact intrusion and avoidance, but not a significant relation, although a trending one for anxiety. In our second study, we found here realistic threat significantly related to all three outcomes, as well as symbolic threat, as we predicted. And finally, in study 3, this longitudinal follow-up where we went back to the folks in study 1 a week later to see how that threat predicted their outcomes a week later, we find that realistic threat predicted anxiety and impact intrusion, and symbolic threat predicted all three significantly. So across the board, while we do see on some of the metrics a stronger, perhaps, or more robust impact for one threat versus the other, across the whole, I would say this suggests that both of these threats have unique and meaningful impacts for our mental health. So what about our public health behaviors? Here we assessed our adherence, so self-reported, did I actually engage in these behaviors? Adherence to restrictive public health behaviors, such as staying home and avoiding all social contact, but also non-socially restrictive behaviors, such as washing hands often for at least 20 seconds every day. And these we didn't expect as perhaps a strong and negative association in terms of symbolic threat detracting from it, because it's not really disrupting our social systems as the socially restrictive ones would. And then finally, this general attitude of supporting socially restrictive public health behaviors. And again, here we're going to expect greater adherence to social distancing for realistic threat and less adherence now for symbolic threat. So here we'll expect both threats to move in an opposite direction when entered into one regression model. So again, I'm going to show you results using the same format as we had before. So what did we find? So in our first study, actually I should say in our second study, in our first wave of the first study, we didn't measure the social distancing outcome. So in study 2, we find that realistic threat was positively associated across the board with greater socially restrictive public health behaviors, and as well the non-restrictive ones, washing our hands, as we would expect. But we find the opposite for symbolic threat. It's negatively predicting support for socially restrictive public health behaviors. And interestingly, we don't see as strong a negative relation in terms of its adherence to hand washing, which we would expect. And we replicated these findings in study 3 longitudinally. So the amount of threat that people experienced a week earlier then predicted engagement in these public health behaviors a week later. Okay, so the final study I'm going to share with you is this follow-up on Memorial Day in the United States. This work has not been published yet. It's newer data. And what we did is we asked and wanted to see how the threat that Americans felt in March predicted whether or not they would engage in traditional Memorial Day celebrations. So in the United States, Memorial Day is a day where we remember the sacrifices made by American soldiers for America. And part of the traditions and norms we do in this is getting together socially, having cookouts, getting together on the beach. And in fact, in the United States, there are a bunch of headlines before Memorial Day kind of saying, will Americans be able to resist the temptation of, being social on this very social holiday? And just in terms of narratives we collected from our participants, we see that, some participants did describe making these changes. Normally we have big family celebrations and friends come over and we'll have a barbecue, but today we really stayed home. Only one family member came for 30 minutes and left. And they did this because of COVID-19. Well, we see other participants trudged along. On a typical Memorial Day, I travel out to visit family, and I did again this year what I typically do. I went, I traveled, I saw family. My behavior didn't change. So we measured the extent to which people changed their just traditional engagement in Memorial Day customs on this Memorial Day versus past Memorial Days, and also a general attempt to socially distance on Memorial Day. And again, I'll present results to you similarly how I did before, although here I'm going to also show that these effects hold controlling for political ideology. You might think that, oh, this is just political rhetoric, but we're going to control for that here. And I'll also show you the relations or the effects of political ideology on these outcomes. So what we find is that realistic threat, as predicted, leads to greater changes in these social behaviors on Memorial Day amongst Americans. And again, this is data, this was threat 2 months earlier predicting what people did 2 months later. Where in terms of symbolic threat, we find a just borderline significant 0.05 effect in terms of changing the specific Memorial Day customs, and also a more robust relation between general attempts to socially distance on Memorial Day. And here are the effects of political ideology. We didn't see a significant effect in terms of changing the specific Memorial Day customs, but we did see also a negative relationship between ideology and social distancing, general attempts to social distance. So what, in summary, did we find? We find that realistic threat, as we predicted, leads to greater mental distress, less mental health, but greater adherence to social distancing guidelines, where symbolic threat, we also find has these important impacts, implications for our mental health, but leads to less social distancing behaviors. And together, this kind of shows the importance of examining these two distinct threats simultaneously, because in terms of our social distancing behaviors, it can have a push and pull effect. And it's only when you tease apart and pull out these distinct types of threat from just a general, are you threatened type of question in this context, might we really, be able to understand the richness of what's going on psychologically. In terms of implications, and to wrap up, we offer a short and I hope valid measurement tool of these two unique types of threat. And we start to show the importance of starting to differentiate between them psychologically as people experience this pandemic. And it might also give some insight into future avenues for interventions we can do to get people to social distance. There's a rich body of work in the social identity literature about affirming social identities, and perhaps some of those interventions could be applied in this context to protect our sense of social identities as we engage the difficult process of changing our societies and our social norms to cope with this pandemic. In terms of limitations, again, this is all self-report measures, so it'll be important to find ways to link these threats to more behavioral outcomes of behavior. It's also specific to the United States and American social identity. We know that, Americans especially value this sense of individual freedoms and liberties. So it'll be interesting to see, perhaps in collectivistic cultures, we'll see less of a negative pull of these symbolic threats taking away from our engagement in social distancing, but we might still see it as impacting negatively our mental health in those cultures. And so that, I think, could be an interesting avenue for future work. And then it's also important to note that in these samples, even within the United States, they were at 80% white participants. But in the US, underrepresented groups were the most negatively impacted by this virus, as well as people with lower SES. And so it'll be really important, to extend this work to specifically focus on those underrepresented populations and groups with less privilege in terms, or less advantages, I should say, in terms of their social economic status. So thank you so much to all my collaborators on this work and our funding, and to all of you for listening to it virtually.
Thank you so much, Frank, for that really wonderful talk. We had already started talking about threat and fear yesterday, so this really puts us one step further. And again, trying to say that we need a more nuanced view of these things. So I suppose as a behavioral neuroscientist, my first point is that there's clearly an adaptive reason why we consider threat, right? Why we internally generate these images in our mind, and clearly it's behaviorally relevant to make predictions about what's about to happen. And the way you've broken down your design into realistic and symbolic make me think that maybe there's another way to think about realistic and symbolic, and that realistic is sometimes easier to put into an image, whereas symbolic can theoretically be more abstract. And that subsequently, as a result, the response to one may be more of a fear-like response, and the response to the other, the more abstract one, might be a more anxiety-like one. And so just a very quick question from me is that when you compared study 1, 2, and 3 together, you show that in the study 1, these weren't correlated with anxiety. And that then looking at study 2 and 3, they all of a sudden did. So the question is it that we had built up enough information to, first of all, create an image in our head? But interestingly, both symbolic and realistic threats are correlated with anxiety. So there's a couple of questions in there. You're welcome to pick out any one that makes sense to you. Otherwise, there were a couple of comments on the chat, and then we'll have to switch to our next speaker. But over to you on that.
Yeah. So quickly, I think one thing too to note is that we do see this kind of, I'd say, somewhat weaker effects for just direct anxiety of symbolic threat, perhaps because, as you say, it's a more abstract thing that we're processing. Although I should note that the same participants in study 3, where we do see that the effect is now significant on anxiety, that was there. It's the same threat measure in both study 1 and 3, but when we go at it longitudinally, perhaps we have more sensitivity to pick out the effects. So I do think they're both playing a role, but as you say, it is a bit more of a cognitive leap, or and I think even as researchers, we often first focus immediately on the realistic, and then we take a step back and go, oh wait, all this other stuff is going on. And we're social psychologists that think about this all the time. So, for people in their day-to-day lives, my reckoning is they're not even really compartmentalizing these threats either. They're just in their experience. And I don't know if that answers your question.
No, absolutely. And I think that just sort of to close up, I think as a really nice way to put it together is you introduced this idea of an integrated threat theory, and that there are so many different ways of thinking about threat. Another way might be to think about health-related threats versus threats to freedom, as you suggested, threats to ourselves. I looked in your little questionnaire, and they're clearly things that are more relevant to me specifically versus things that are more related to us as a group. And so you could really think about breaking things down in that way.
we do have to cut it short. There will be stuff added extra to the chat. But thank you once again, Frank, for your wonderful talk, for waking up early to tell us what you have been working on.